everyone. Welcome back to Ask a Political Scientist. I am your host, Andrea Jones-Rooy. We are back for a very special limited edition election season. We have 6 shows between now and Election Day. And then once Election Day comes, I think political science might be canceled, as will the country. So we'll see what happens after that. But until then, we have a lot to talk about. And we're talking about big topics related to the election and how to think about all the craziness that's going on. So welcome back for season 2 to those who were with us for season 1, and welcome new friends as well to our series. All right, so my name's Andrea Jones-Rooy. Here is a picture of what I look like when I'm allowed to go outside and into theater venues where we normally do this show. The main thing I want you to know about me is that I love political science, and my graduate student self would never have believed that I would publicly announce this. But I do love political science. I think political science is awesome, and I wish more people knew about it, read about it, read political science directly, hung out with political scientists, and generally talked about it all the time. So that is what this show is here to help encourage. Today, we are talking about polarization, and in particular, we are going to talk about how we got so polarized, how bad it is, what it really means, how worried we should be about it, and then we're going to all talk about what we can do about it. Our first guest today, we have 2 guests. Our first guest coming to the show is our star political scientist. He is one of my absolute favorite political scientists. I'm so honored that he is joining the show. He is a professor at Stanford University. His name is Neil Malhotra, and he has written about 10,000 articles about all kinds of very important things. Polarization is one of the topics that he has written tons and tons on. One of the pieces that I really recommend that you all check out is an article that came out in 2019, The Origins and Consequences of Affective Polarization in the United States. And we'll be talking about what affective polarization is in just a moment. After Neil and I have a chat, we are going to bring on my dear friend, Sarah Garner. Sarah is an educator. She was a pre-K instructor for a very long time, and she is here to help us figure out how to overcome our conflicts and join the conversation on what to do about it. And one of the many reasons I wanted to invite Sarah on the show is not just because of her pre-K skills that I think might be valuable, but also because back in the before times, she used to run a comedy advice show called Not a Therapist, where she would host it. She would have a suite of comedians, and the audience would ask their deepest, darkest questions, and the comedians and Sarah would give advice. So Sarah is not a therapist, but she is a very good free therapist when you go to free comedy shows. And so I'm thrilled to have her here because I think this country, and frankly, I personally need a bit of therapy. So we will have Sarah join us partway through. Every show, we are free. It's very important to me that the good news about political science is available to everybody. So it's a totally free show. If you wish to donate, maybe what the price of a ticket might be, let's assume this is an extremely expensive Broadway show, hypothetically, you can donate whatever you feel would be the cost of a ticket or whatever you're able. I know this is pretty bad times, in case that's news to anyone, for a lot of folks in terms of income. But if you have anything to spare, we raise money for a different cause every week. This week, we're very excited to support the Earth Science Women's Network, which, among many things, provides mentoring and funding for women in the geosciences and earth sciences in particular. And particularly this month, right now, they are partnering with another organization that is specifically providing funding and mentorship for Black and Indigenous women and gender nonconforming and transgender folks in the sciences. So please donate what you can. It will go straight there. Happy to provide receipts in case you think I'm just buying vegan cheese, which I am, but not with your money. Don't worry about that. All right. So here's what's going to happen today. We're going to bring on Neil in just a moment. We're going to talk about how we got here, how bad the situation is. Sarah's going to join us to help all of us discuss what we can do about it. And in the final part of the show, we are going to take your questions. So Ask a Political Scientist means just that. You can ask our scientists, and you can ask Sarah, you can ask me any question that you want. And that's where we'll take the show. So be thinking as we go. I'm sure there's plenty on everyone's minds. And frankly, it doesn't even have to be related to polarization. If you want to know what Neil and Sarah think about the meaning of life, frankly, I do too. So no question is off limits. All right, without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm YouTube welcome to our first guest, Neil. Welcome, Neil. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you for being here with us. Now, are you well and safe during the madness? You seem to be in a place that's not on fire, for example.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, for
Yeah,
asking.
good.
Yeah, when you wake up in the morning and it looks like Mars, it can be a bit disconcerting, but everything is good here now and beautiful as it should be. But
Okay.
the image of apocalypse is still in my head.
Yeah, I was going to say you seem very cheerful for someone who's facing the apocalypse in many ways. Well, thank you for fighting your way through the red skies to be with us. The other thing I want to ask before we dive into your work is, how are you feeling about politics these days?
I think I'm a bit scared.
Okay.
Just because I think we are heading for like tit for tat moments where every party is threatening to keep ramping up violation of norms. And, we used to rely on something called forbearance. It's a term actually from financial services, which is just because you can collect on a loan, you don't have to do it. So because you have the power to do something in politics doesn't mean you have to do it. I think American democracy used to rely a lot on forbearance, and that's going out the window.
Right. Well, and we'll talk a little bit more about how things are getting potentially heated from those sorts of things. But to the topic of polarization, what I wanted to do first is you are, for those who don't know, basically one of the reigning experts of polarization in political science. That is my hot take, and I will stand by it. I want you to, if you could talk us through, how have political scientists been thinking about polarization? When did we start thinking about it? What does it mean to us? I mean, polarization can mean a lot of different things. Like, when did we start even thinking about this as a concept?
Sure. I actually think one nice historical moment is a report written by political scientists in the 1950s that was very influential. And that report said that the country was not polarized enough, that the parties were too similar to each other. And it's kind of, when we think of politics working well and low levels of polarization, it's sort of this unique period in American history in the post-World War II era. But if you look at through the main swath of American history, there have been very, very polarized times that look a lot like the time we're living in now. And I think kind of when you look at it now, we have the opposite problem where political scientists are talking about how there's too much polarization and the parties are too far apart.
So thanks a lot, 1950s, for saying we needed to spread out. So, okay, so before we go any further, so how are we defining polarization? You said parties are spread out. What's the kind of traditional sense of polarization here?
Sure. So I think kind of if you talk about like modern studies of polarization, I think Mo Fiorina wrote a book in advance of the 2004 election called Culture War, which I think set a lot of the agenda of the next 15 years of research. And so you can pick that book up off any bookstore.
Very good book. Yes.
And I think the 2000 election, I don't know if many of your readers are too young to remember that election or watchers, but
I have a lot of children like this show, so they're gonna have no idea what you're talking about. But I was in college. It was my first election that I voted in, and it was set a bad precedent for elections for me, and the world. The country.
So yeah, you have to kind of remember what elections looked like prior to that. So the 1992 and 1996 elections were these very strange elections with 3 candidates running, and Bill Clinton wins Montana and like weird stuff like this because of the 3-party nature of it. And then the 1980 to 88 elections are landslide elections where the entire country is one color and they love Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And the 1976, the colors on the map were like really make no sense. And it used to be that blue meant incumbent and red meant challenger. And then the 2000 election changed everything. It made red mean Republican and blue mean Democrat. So it's famous picture.
Wow, that early.
Times. Yeah. Before then, you'll basically see Ronald Reagan all in blue across the country. When I was in history class in grade school, we had the big map on the board. It was all blue. It was the Reagan landslide all in blue. So the 2000 election really kind of puts this image in people's heads of a red America and a blue America. It kind of makes the coast look very blue. The Great Lakes look very blue, and the rest of the center of the country look very red. So I think a lot of the studies of polarization were the media reaction to that red-blue map. And Fiorina's point was that just because you're closely divided, it doesn't mean you're deeply divided. So you can have an electorate be 50-50, but still people generally in the middle. And also people, you can have very extreme choices. So the elites can polarize and people can still stay in the middle, but it looks like they're polarized because they're choosing between whoever is closer to them, these two extreme candidates. So that's kind of how we think of polarization in terms of issues. Most of my research is really not on that because actually I don't actually find it that interesting, and we can actually explain why.
Stick burn for Morris Fiorina's research agenda. Okay.
I a lot of back and forth from that research agenda. I was not very passionate about studying, so I got more into different views of polarization, which I think are more relevant. I study kind of how people perceive polarization, and often there's misperceptions of it, and also study, as you mentioned in your outset, affective polarization. So polarization is tied more to identity and not issues.
Okay, so perfect. So I want to go right there, but just so I'm recapping the kind of classic thinking, Morris Fiorina, early 2000s approach to polarization is, we look very divided on this map. Our legislators might be very different. We're forced to choose between different legislators, so we look quite polarized. But actually, if you zoom in on the issues, most Americans are still moderates. Is that fair?
I think that's right. And moreover, if you look at dynamics, because I think some of the media said 2000 was some like game-changing election where the country got polarized. Fiorina's point was also that if you look at over time, the distribution of attitudes on these issues hasn't changed that much.
Okay. So it sounds like the punchline at that point in time is like, everyone just calm down. We're actually kind of okay. And it's kind of been this way for a while.
That's right. So Fiorina, his research agenda, he's sort of a consummate moderate. So I think a lot of his research is projecting his own beliefs sometimes to the public.
Another sick burn. I should have brought him on for a rebuttal. This is exciting. Wow.
So this is an example. He wrote a book about divided government, which argued that the reason we have divided government is that people want to moderate extremes. So maybe
you want to moderate extremes. All right, I'm going to ask, Sarah will no longer be playing herself. She will be playing Morris Fiorina when she joins the show. So Sarah, prepare yourself for that. All right, so that's that story. All right, now enter Neil and your colleagues. So tell us more about what it is that you're focusing on. So we're not talking about issues here. We're talking about something else.
Sure. So, I think one question I asked was, even if people are moderate, generally, like how do you kind of get, even at the mass level, this sense that people don't like each other? So I kind of focused on perceived polarization. So in kind of the early part of the decade, Matt Levandowski and I wrote a paper which basically said, where are people, but where do they place the parties, their fellow partisans? And people really like viewing themselves as moderate and other people as extreme. So
we all think the world revolves around us
That's right, yeah.
Issue space.
That's right. And I think there's some older political science work that's also argued that independence is viewed as like a positive trait. And so people like thinking of themselves as like, there's these other partisans, but I look at the facts and the issues and I'm different. But you can see kind of the flip side to that, which is, if you view the world that way, then you see everybody else as extreme. And there's asymmetry where you see the other party as very extreme. And then there's also around that a literature on partisan stereotyping. Democrats think all Republicans own guns, and Republicans think all Democrats own electric cars. There's been a bunch of survey findings around that as well.
Right. Okay, so it's this idea that we all think of ourselves as more moderate, and I bet even as you're saying this, I'm like, right, he's saying that most people are not as moderate as they think, but I'm like, but I know I'm really quite moderate. So we all think that we're more moderate. We think stereotypically about the other group. Do we think stereotypically about our own group as well? So I'm a Democrat. I'll just reveal it. I'm supposed to be a nonpartisan show. I've already outed myself within the first 15 minutes of season 2, but okay. I identify as a Democrat. Do I then also think that all Democrats have hybrid cars, et cetera? Or I see that I'm moderate compared to all those hippies with their hybrid cars?
So at least what Matt and I found was that you view yourself as more moderate than the typical Democrat. And also the key point is you're misperceiving Democrats as more liberal than they are. This effect is more pronounced for the opposite party. So I think that the Republicans are super extreme.
Right.
Even they're actually more moderate.
Okay.
So that was kind of like responding to the Fiorina point, which is like, yes, like people can still be moderate, but you can see why there could still be partisan tensions, even if people are moderate issue positions.
Okay. And then to your big term, or the term that I know your work for, in addition, I know you from affective polarization. By the way, viewers, Neil has also done a lot of great work on disaster preparedness versus disaster response. And I saw you present a paper on, it was something to do with when the home football team wins in a college town, it's like good for the mayor. So his research is all over the place and it's awesome. But back to affective polarization is one of the things you're most known for. So what is affective polarization?
Sure. So I would have to give credit to Shanto Iyengar and his colleagues, who's your guest next week, I guess.
Yes, we have Shanto next week.
Who really brought this term, in 2012 with his co-authors. And so I think their argument was, which is you can be very moderate on policy issues, but still express very extreme responses on how you view the other party. So like, do you like them? Do you find yourself socially distant from them? And the kind of questions they like asking are, would you be upset if your son or daughter married someone of the other party? And what they found was there actually has been more extremity on these kinds of questions over time, which Fiorina didn't found. Or like if you had to rate how warm or cold you feel towards someone of the opposite party, how's that changed?
And for those watching at home, this is the ANES feeling thermometer, which is one of the coolest named political science tools out there. So yes. So how do you feel about the other party? Right. Okay. So we've gotten colder towards other parties. We get worried if our son or daughter or child is going to marry someone from the other party, right? Okay.
That's right. And then, a lot of my research was trying to say, okay, well, how does this then spill over to the non-political domain? So looking at like whether people are less likely to date each other, we got a lot of great data from online dating sites where you can look at people before they meet. And we also did a lot of work looking at various markets like online labor markets and consumer markets to see if people were less likely to interact economically. And those effects I think were not huge, and sometimes they were a lot weirder than you expected. So there was more partisan love than partisan hate. So people wanted to interact with people who shared their party, but weren't necessarily eschewing people from the opposite party. So I think there's kind of nuanced results, but I generally agree with the premise that kind of viewing polarization from an identity point of view. Because really affective polarization is, well, why don't you like someone of the opposite party, even though you share this similar beliefs as them? We're like, beliefs are not that far apart ideologically. Well, the only logical reason can be you perceive them as more extreme, or you view them as like the out group from an identity point of view. So that's kind of how I like seeing the world, how it makes sense in my head.
I like it. So it makes sense to think about it from an identity perspective as opposed to we think of it as necessarily issues. So, okay. So one, is affective polarization getting greater? Is the disdain for the other side getting greater over time? And if so, to what do you attribute this cleaving?
So it has, and I would say like one argument that's been discussed in literature, and there's evidence back and forth on this. I don't want to bore people with it, but I kind of this show is for people who want to hear the evidence, and if not, they're probably all going to sign off right now. So bore us, and I'll stop you if it's too much. Sure. Yeah. So one reason that report in the 1950s didn't find very much polarization is that we actually had like a three-party system at the time. Where you had Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and Republicans, and they really were very different on many dimensions of politics. And what's gone on, for the last 60, 70 years is sort of a realignment process where the parties are sorted. So conservatives are Republicans and liberals are Democrats, whereas in the 1970s, you would meet plenty of conservative Democrats in Congress in the country. You would meet plenty of liberal Northeastern Republicans. And I think one thing that's caused this affective polarization is that when I tell you that someone's a Republican, then you basically concoct a whole bunch of traits. And you wouldn't be like totally inaccurate, especially at the elite level, where there's just not as many cross-cutting issues and cross-cutting identities. And so even though I think at the mass level, some of those stereotypes are inaccurate, a lot of these issues are hanging together. So just an example I always like to tell people is just two kind of anecdotes. So one, the 1976 election, the pro-choice, pro-women's right candidate was the Republican Gerald Ford.
Okay. Even that's hard to make sense of in my brain. So, okay, I believe you.
Evangelical Christian who was a little bit more who Jerry Falwell endorsed was Jimmy Carter. And now that would be kind of inconceivable. And similarly, after there's like, let's say a school shooting or something, you see kind of members of the Christian right say, oh, we should have guns and security guards at schools. And, before you'd be like, I can understand like Christian right talking about abortion or gay marriage, but like, what does guns have anything to do with it? And now you see basically all these issues are kind of intertwined. And so just the parties are more sorted on what it means in your worldview is.
So if I'm a Democrat, the probability that any of my issues overlap with what someone I meet who's a Republican is way smaller. Whereas in the past, it would be like, yeah, I'm liberal on this, but conservative on that. And we have kind of more to talk about and can understand each other.
I think, the jury's a little bit out on the mass level.
Okay.
Some people find there's a lot of multi-dimensional preferences at the mass level, but at the elite level, I think this is very much the case.
Okay.
And that's why I think no matter what gets voted on in Congress, there's almost no partisan overlap on many of these bills, issues, and votes.
Okay. So I want to, I'm going to bring on Sarah in just a moment. The last thing, and we're going to talk a lot about this, folks watching next week when we deep dive on the media, but I'm just curious to hear from you, Neil, because the media is so often talked about in the context of polarization. In your view, in your research, what's the role of the media here? And I'll leave it to you, traditional media, social media, both. What's your sense here?
Matt Lewandowski and I, wrote a paper where we argued that the media is responsible for creating this perceptions of polarization. So part of that is we did content analyses over time to really show that the coverage of media polarization has increased. And this experimental work that showed that when you kind of do these vignette-based studies on, I'm going to go to the diner and interview the extreme Republican, and I'm going to go somewhere else and interview the extreme Democrat. This kind of coverage does make people look at the other side as more extreme. People respect them less, as opposed to the Fiorina type statistics, which show the picture is way more muddled. People are less likely to attribute negative things to the other side.
Interesting. So I thought you were going to go in the direction of media, as in we select into different media and therefore we stopped having overlapping ideas. But actually, it's the media talking about polarization and pointing out these extreme views that makes us think we're more polarized, and then we like the other side less because we think that we're so far apart.
Yes.
Yikes. Well, all right. Turn off the media. I don't know what to say. So this brings us to the question that I have for you and the question that I have for our next guest as well, is what do we do about this? So please join me, everyone, Neil, everyone, in welcoming Sarah to the show. Sarah, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine. I'm just, sitting on my fire escape, hoping it breaks,
Yeah, perfect.
We all are.
That's the kind of cheer that I miss. So, and honestly, between us and everyone watching, as this show is going on, it smells like smoke in my building. And I was just like, am I going to die on a live stream? I don't know. So we're all in precarious situations. Okay. So Sarah, before we get into polarization, I want to ask you, what tips do you have based on your work in pre-K? I'm sure there's a lot of conflict resolution. Any advice that you have for two sides that just somehow keep, being at each other's throats?
Yeah, I mean, other than hire a licensed counselor to help mediate, I think it's.
No, I wouldn't dismiss that. Neil, is there room for hiring a licensed national counselor? Can
we do that? A mediator?
I think in a lot of mixed partisan marriages, that would be useful.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
Plug for my parents, they're both therapists. Okay. I think it's funny. I was thinking about today, I'm thinking about how we handled conflict in my classroom. And a lot of it really was requiring the perpetrator, right? Okay, I taught pre-K. There was a lot of fighting of kids. If you didn't know, that's a thing that preschoolers do. Some adults, but mostly preschoolers. And you really just require the kid to see you hurt your friend, right? They're crying because you bit them, Like that hurt them. And so there's like a listening aspect and like an understanding of how the other person feels that I think is necessary to be able to like make some sort of restoration, right? And so you see that like in restorative justice, which is now the thing that many classrooms do, is talking about like what was the actual impact of what happened on you, and then what does that person need to be able to like make some sort of like amends, right? Like make the situation better. And I think when you're communicating with people, like, and things become heated, like that pausing and listening and understanding of like, what's the impact of what I'm saying? Maybe what's the impact of like my policy decisions and what I'm saying about it on this other person? Like if they're a gay person, if they're a Black person, if they're a person that's marginalized, like maybe my actions or maybe my thoughts and what I'm saying is having an impact. And so like that pausing and understanding first before moving on is something that I don't think, I'm not the expert, Neil, you is happening that much right now, especially as we become more divided in how we view other people.
Yeah. Is that happening?
I think the point on restorative justice is a very good one. And I mean, I think you can maybe look to research on very contentious conflicts around the world and see what people have done on those. So this conflict is not in good shape right now, but there's been a lot of research done on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And one thing they found, as to Sarah's point, is kind of acknowledging that something bad happened to the other side. It doesn't have to be that you did it. But for example, when a Palestinian acknowledges the Holocaust to the Israeli, it actually was like a very powerful way to help break down barriers, because then an Israeli person would be like, oh, like you understood something to happen to my people. And then it opens you up. Okay, let me understand what might have happened to your people, you know?
And are you seeing this, Neil, happening in anywhere in the United States on, the left says something hateful to the right or vice versa, or even at a local level? Is there any example of this? On the chat, let me know if you can think of a single example.
I was going to say not at my Thanksgiving in Ohio, but
yeah,
that's not happening.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what would that, I don't even know what that would look like. Neil, does your research get into what do we do about affective polarization, or what would reduce it, in addition to understanding our impact on others, which I'll say I don't spend a lot of time worrying if I'm offending the right, to be honest.
Yeah. So I'm working on a project right now to, like, for example, assess social media and things that maybe you could change about social media to make it less polarizing potentially. But, Matt Lewandowski has done some work that argues if you just kind of change the identities. So and it's like if you focus on a national identity versus a partisan identity. So I don't know if you the comic book Watchmen or watch the show or whatever, but that argument I think has not borne fruit. So the argument is, as long as there's a shared threat, then people come together. But, we have a shared threat right now, and it seemed to not help bring the country together.
Is it bad that I actually was like, ooh, which of the threats is it that he's referring to?
I can't figure out which one. There's so many.
Yeah, there's so many threats that could be uniting us. But this is a great example, because we've even made the threat. So let's assume we're talking about COVID, though. Of course, it could be all kinds of things. We've interpreted the threat differently on the different sides, right? I mean, is that different interpretation of what's happening? Is that a kind of polarization, or does that not fall under polarization?
I think it does. And it could mean that this COVID pandemic is just something very unique. If it was something more like a new Cold War, against one of these other superpowers, whether it's like Russia or China or something, who knows? That may look different than COVID. But, in the 1950s, Sputnik happens. People look in the sky, they see it, and everybody, Republicans and Democrats, are like, wow, we are screwed, and we got to do something about this. And the pandemic didn't have that, because maybe it didn't have like that singular moment. But I think this is an open question.
Is this where, and I'm curious how this maps to the 2000 election. So 9/11 provides something like that. I mean, we've all been talking about how it was a very different experience for the country at the time. Yeah,
and so that was very interesting historical case study, because right after, you guys probably remember 9/11, George W. Bush's approval ratings were 95%. And I doubt the president have those kind of approval ratings again. And this is my personal.
Given what drove it, yeah.
Yeah, right. This is my personal belief, so just my own views. But I think the Iraq War kind of squandered that in many ways, because it kind of took something that we actually had a united thing against and really divided the country, and we still see a lot of those divisions today. But keep in mind, this is George W. Bush, who had a very contentious way to get into office, and then 1 year after, like a Supreme Court case, he has 90% approval rating.
Right. Yeah, he was the most dicey election, apart from maybe what we're facing now, but we set that aside. We proceed as though democracy exists in this show for the time being. Okay, so affective polarization, we hate each other more, versus this party sorting, where we used to have some more liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Why did that split start to happen? Is that a media story as well? Why did we stop having kind of people who crossed over in their views?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very complex historical process. And so I think the answer to that is everything in American history and politics has to really be viewed through the lens of race. Like basically all the realignments have been over racial issues. So when in the and there's many historical reasons for this. So for example, Eric Schickler wrote a book about the union movement, was very anti-Black, and then it became more pro-African-American. There's reasons for that. But basically in the 1960s, you have kind of the Republican Party take the strategy that we will be the party against civil rights, and the Democrats make the national decision will be the party for civil rights. But it takes a lot of years for that sorting to work itself out. So we have a huge incumbency advantage. And so if you have these Southern Democratic incumbents that you have to wait till they lose, it takes a lot of years to finally get rid of them all in many ways and to make them all into Republicans. And really, I think the 2010 election and partly 2014 is kind of the finishing of this, right? This realignment process where all the state legislatures, I think even the Mississippi state legislature used to be Democratic up until something very recently. And it finally becomes Republican very, very recently. That all took a lot of time to fix because of the power of state and local parties, the power of incumbent politicians, things like that.
Do you think that geography is an explainer? So we talk about urban-rural divides. We've talked about the coast. Sarah, you and I are in New York City, and you referenced Ohio, right? We automatically have a sense that politics are different, right? So what's the role of geography here? Is there a role?
I think it's huge.
Okay.
So Jonathan Rodden just recently wrote a book about this. It's also a book you can get off Amazon.
Excellent. What's the name of the book?
I forget. I think it's about why cities lose. I think that's the title.
Someone in New York where people are having a lot of conversations, that's a very difficult thing for me to hear. But why cities lose? Yeah, go ahead and check that out. Yeah.
But Jonathan's an expert at making maps. So if you really like watching great maps, it's full of really good maps. But he's found some interesting things, which is, this is kind of a big divide. And I think the media makes it very simple when they talk about states. I mean, states are these very aggregate, messy units. California, a lot of California is very rural and conservative, but you just kind of look at this big blue state that's 65% Democrat. So I think this coast versus periphery is not the right way to think about it, but it's really the urban cores, and then you get into the exurbs and the rural areas. And Rodden's book is really amazing because he finds that it's like a fractal, that this kind of pattern repeats itself at even smaller scales. So just what he shows, for example, is you can go to these random places like Terre Haute, Indiana, and you see the microcosm of that. Whereas the Main Street, where is very Democratic, this is Main Street.
Like a tiny town, you still see it.
You still see it, where the core is more liberal and the more periphery is more, and he gives a lot of reasons for this, like government workers tend to live on Main Street at the core. That's where the courthouses are. That's where City Hall is. Maybe that's where a lot of the hospitals and schools are, things like that. And the more you get into the hinterlands, the more conservative it gets. And I think there's a lot of great research. The qualitative research of Kathy Kramer-Walsh is really on this too. Those are I think the two great books you should read for the qualitative perspective and the more quantitative perspective on this. But I think that's
yes. Kathy Kramer-Walsh was a Michigan PhD, and she wrote her dissertation by asking qualitative work, asking people in this famous ice cream shop in town, like what they thought about politics and trying to understand like local town life. And it was just, I was like, you can do a dissertation in an ice cream store? That's way better than what I was doing. So she's awesome. So Sarah, you are from Ohio, or your family's in Ohio. Do you, first, does this kind of microcosm that Neil is describing, does that play out in sort of basically anywhere other than New York City that you've been?
Yeah, it's actually funny. I was thinking about that this weekend. I was at my girlfriend's house for Rosh Hashanah, and they're like New Jersey, always been New Jersey, always been coastal. And I was talking to her about the way that like we talk on the East Coast, and I do it now too, having lived here for years. I lived in Chicago before this, which is like a liberal bubble as well. Talking about how I even talk about my hometown in Ohio, I'm from Toledo, as like this backwoods place. And it actually is much different than that, right? It's not a backwoods place. We're not all gun-toting. My parents are very liberal. Toledo was liberal for most of my life. Now it's obviously different, but growing up, we always had Democratic representation. We always went blue. Like I think I see the way that we categorize people, and Neil, like you were saying, by state even, that anybody in the middle of the country is like a gun-toting, pro-life, evangelical Christian trying to convert everybody. Well, actually, there's so much more nuance to that than I think we even get here in New York, right? New York is not very diverse politically, right? Especially like where I live in, but look, I have purple hair, right? Like there's no...
You can't get away with that in the middle of the country. Yeah, there's some, yeah.
Look at me. They're like, it's too short, it's too purple, what's wrong with you, you know?
Yeah.
And so I see that, I like to think I'm holier than thou and don't view the other side with that kind of lens, but I will view the other side that way, even just sheerly by the location, by the place that you are from, And I think even when people find out I'm from Ohio, they're like, oh my God, like you have to go back there.
Jeez.
Like, actually quite beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I'm from rural Maryland, and I have a newfound appreciation for my lovely hometown as well. Yes, same patterns. So, okay, so Neil, has your work, you talked about in economic environments, it's not necessarily the case that we're not mixing as much. Like Democrats and Republicans, have some overlapping interests and some overlapping exchanges. Is there any, either like a subset of the country or like a pocket where people are getting to be less hateful towards each other? Are you seeing the trend reverse anywhere, or is it we're all getting more affectively polarized as we go? Like,
give us hope, Neil.
Where's the hope? This is no pressure, but
this is not really research based. It's more personal based.
I'll take it.
I think what's really fascinating is if you look at professional sports teams, because most of the white athletes on these teams are very conservative. And especially if you look at sports like baseball and hockey, those kind of sports. And many of the black athletes are more liberal and democratic, and they're actually in some sports becoming more outspoken about social justice issues. Yet, like, the perception is that it's like these teams are falling apart or ripping apart at the seams, etc. And I guess like there is, and sports is like a weird kind of microcosm because there's like a very common purpose, and moreover, like there's kind of this forced interaction where people kind of are forged through very common experiences and a lot of trials and tribulations. So I don't know, like that's just sort of like a seed of an idea. And there has been some research on this. So Diana Mutz, for example, has done research that workplaces are potential avenues to reduce polarization because a way you're forced to interact potentially with people who you may not agree with, and learn the kind of their humanity and kind of get a sense of a common goal and purpose that you can achieve together. That's distinct from politics. So I don't know. That's kind of a random thought, but maybe it's for some people to look at.
Okay. I will look forward to your paper in a year or 2 years, depending on how the peer review process goes on the sports. But I can say it's also anecdotally. So I do some social science research consulting with companies, and one company in particular right now is like how do we set up the boundaries for what politics we're allowed to talk about at the office? Because we want people to all feel like they get along, but based on the industry that they're in, they're about half sort of traditionally quite conservative Republican and half kind of coastal liberal. And they're at basically like, should we just forbid talking about it? Are we allowed to do that? And basically that's what they're doing. And maybe that's helpful, actually. I want to make sure we have time for some audience questions. So here comes an audience question. So from Don Rushman. Hello, Rushman. Is polarization unique to the US two-party system? Or is it just where humans go even when there's a third or more choices? Can we learn anything from other countries, or are we just effed? Effed is a technical political science word. I'm so pleased to see you using that. Yes, thank you. So unique to two parties, or are humans just going to find a way to hate each other even if we have a million choices? And can we learn from anyone else?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll just cite some other people's work on that. So
right.
Matt Genskow and his colleagues have a paper basically trying to replicate these affective polarization things around the world. And they find the US is kind of a bit of an outlier on that. It's very high. And various people have done kind of these economic games with different partisans all across the world. And the US, it exists everywhere, but the US is very high.
Okay.
So it could be, our institutions produce this two-party system. And I think there is a lot of truth to that, because if you have two parties which don't have cleavages, cross-cutting cleavages, they're sorted in very clear ways demographically and identity-based, it is almost like a powder keg. And I would also say once you throw that a match on that, which is that the elections are so high stakes. I'm just looking at the Supreme Court thing right now, which is, part of like kind of making politics work is it has to be okay to lose. Part of it because you'll be in power again, but that like you lose, like stuff will not go your way for a little while, but it's not like the end of the world. Every election is so knife edge and it seems like the end of the world. So Lee Drutman has a great book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, which is another thing maybe people want to add, which kind of claim, which
I should start an Amazon store, by the way.
Yeah.
Like this is, yes.
I'm writing all of these down.
Yeah, okay. How to stop the doom loop.
The two-party doom loop, yeah.
Two-party doom loop, that's a title. Okay.
So he basically, his institutional argument, which is, we don't have ranked choice voting, we don't have proportional representation, and all of these types of institutions that are around the world do cool a lot of the flames. I mean, you look at Europe, like there's plenty of like really left-wing parties and really right-wing parties, but they tend to work well in a coalitional format and all that kind of stuff. So.
Does it help your argument about how we see ourselves as more moderate compared to others if we just have more choices to think about? So I think I'm more, those crazy Republicans, but also I'm the thoughtful Democrat. Like if I'm evaluating 10 different parties, am I still thinking of myself as moderate and still just as bad or maybe worse at evaluating the others?
That's a very clever hypothesis. I think no one has ever tested that, but that would be an interesting one to test for sure.
Okay.
Two things together.
Okay. All right. Sarah, do you have friends in other countries who are just like, we don't get what's going on in the US? I have a few non-American friends who are like, you're all so intense. Is that?
Yeah. I'm actually, I was born in Canada. My mom's Canadian. So, look, I can honestly get out of Dodge pretty quick.
I'm so jealous. Yeah.
But my Canadian family, I've always felt like they actually know as much, if not more, about American politics than some Americans that I know, which has always been really funny to me. But they really do take it with this idea of like, what is going on down there? Like we need, like, what is happening? Are you all okay? And then I have a really close friend in France who I think just things don't feel as doomsday for her in their political elections. They're not as scary. It doesn't feel like the world's going to end if your party doesn't get elected. And she just doesn't really understand, again, like what's going on. Are you guys okay? Should we get you out? But she, funnily enough, loves America, wants to move here, obsessed with America, is plotting her move.
Does she want to trade? I'm open to a little
right, like we could
passport swap. Yeah.
But she's only seen New York. and she's seen New York, Chicago, and DC. And so I keep telling her, I'm like, you need to come to Ohio with me. Like, just come, enjoy Ohio. And I want to see what she thinks when she sees more of America, because her view is very, New York is France.
Well, that's a very nice thing to say about New York City, but very, very good. Okay, so we have another viewer question. This is from Sally Jones-Rooy. This is my mother. Thanks, Mom. All right. The current administration has divided the country more than ever. How do we recover from this, and how long will this recovery take? So what's the influence, Neil, of particular leaders? Can they drive further affective polarization or issue-based polarization? And then does swapping that leader do anything, hypothetically?
Yeah, it's very hard to say because, so I think one of the points of this podcast is to kind of highlight the work of other political scientists.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So Gary Jacobson wrote a book in the 2000s called a Divider, Not a Uniter. So basically arguing that George W. Bush came into office claiming to unite, not divide, unlike the 90s, which had all the impeachment fights and everything. And that's not what happened. Ironically, though, if you just took his data and his approach, you could probably do it with Obama and have the same title. At least from my personal perspective, Obama didn't really do a whole lot to inflame things or divide anything. And there's a whole bunch of arguments. You could say there might have been a reaction to the first Black president or whatever. But I think what that shows is that these trends seem to be kind of secular and basically three very different kinds of presidents. So Bush, Obama, and Trump, they're all very different from each other. And yet, it's not like these trends are reversing or changing or anything. So basically kind of the divide in approval ratings where that flat approval rating that Trump has that you see on those charts actually looked kind of like that for Obama too, where he started high and then it was just kind of flat going down and just, was pretty stable over time.
Well, and we have this sense of someone's base, right? And it's I'll never be persuaded to go against you. And this is tied to polarization, but certainly not only a polarization story. I mean, what does it take, or do you have any sense of how someone changes their views? Whether it's my views about Republicans or maybe just making them more nuanced, or my views about a policy, or deciding okay, fine, I'm okay with Obama, or I'm okay with Trump. I mean, is it a socialization thing? Does your work touch on kind of this viewpoint changing at all?
Well, I mean, I think I'm a big believer that partisanship is very stable. Okay. So I think there's a lot of research on that, and that a lot of the changes we see in partisanship, individual level over time, is kind of error in the surveys and all that.
Okay.
I think the socialization story is very big. So Jacobson also has an argument, which is kind of which president you like when you're 18 or 20 matters a lot. And basically, it's this generation that creates it. So a lot of what we see today is a lot of people that thought Ronald Reagan was really cool because he was in the 1980s. Alex P. Keaton was a thing. So if you were a yuppie wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses, you were the cool kid and you were rebelling against your hippie parents. And George W. Bush created a lot of Democrats, in the aftermath of the Iraq War. Trump, maybe Obama created a lot of Democrats. So one argument is if you just look at the cohort patterns, that there's a lot of young Democrats created because of Bush, Obama, Trump. And maybe that's kind of what causes change, is you have cohorts changing, not individual people over time.
Is there a chance that the Trump administration causes more Democrats or something like that? That
is the argument. So that Trump is essentially kind of building and frankly radicalizing a group of very young people that are going to be very staunch Democrats. And because of our views that partisanship doesn't change that much over time, this could create a very strong Democratic majority. That's one argument.
So two possible lessons here. One, if you're on the left and you're nervous, just wait, 30 years?
You still have a democracy, so.
You're assuming the democracy, yes, which we never had to begin American politics research with, but now we will. And then the second is, so when we think about affective polarization, it's unlikely, given that our partisan identities are unlikely to change over time, it's unlikely that we overcome affective polarization by changing people's views. Is it fair that it's more increasing tolerance of one another? Like, is that a better path for us as far as just the tension?
I think it's such a hard question, and if I had an easy answer, I'd just say it. And there's like, there's a lot of NGOs and a lot of civic organizations trying to work on this, and maybe it has to do with like how we teach civics and critical thinking in grade schools and in high schools. But I really want to kind of go back to this identity point, which is I think the more you can make these identities cross-cutting so that there's more diversity within the parties, but I worry that like if the parties themselves are not diverse, and by I mean diverse on many, many different ways, then you kind of have this clash. And it didn't used to be that way. There was more diversity within the parties.
Okay. We have a bunch more audience questions coming in, so I'll be bringing those in. And for folks watching, if you would like to donate whatever amount that you can, we are sending all proceeds this week to the Earth Science Women's Network. And Neil, that was your suggestion. It's a great organization. Is it an organization you know personally or just are aware of? Yeah,
well, my wife is an earth scientist. So her kind of promoting women in STEM is like a big passion of hers.
Awesome.
And I trust the organization because she trusts it.
Excellent. I love it. I love trust. Okay. Question. How much does our siloed cable news and social media make it more difficult to overcome political differences?
Yeah. So, Matt Genskow and colleagues wrote a paper where they showed that polarization is increased most among people who don't use social media. So among older people, et cetera. And so
you just validated a lot of my time wasting. So keep going. Yeah.
I'm aghast.
Yeah.
So it showed some descriptive statistics, which is I don't think the simple answer is, well, Twitter happened and then the world went to hell. I think that's kind of a convenient scapegoat to have. But you can I think there's more research to be done. And one of the projects I'm working on is trying to explore this question, which is maybe there are features of social media that do cause some issues. So for example, the essence of virality and clicks, right? So the algorithms that try to promote engagement. And you can imagine there's the other ways that content is promoted or not promoted. And I think, the social media companies, I think, are understanding this over the last 4 years, which is they've kind of taken the place of the New York Times. They have a lot more editorial judgment and responsibility. And they've been resistant for good business reasons. They're trying to resist that argument, but I see the world changing on that.
I think you just offended the New York Times. You're like, oh, social media is the new New York Times, so see y'all later. Sarah, what's the political diversity on your social media feeds? How does it?
Oh, I don't really have as much. I think when you're young, you live in New York, you're not straight, the people that you socialize with tend to be kind of in one camp.
You're not finding the conservative pockets in New York City?
Not really finding. Sometimes I actually, there was a kid I grew up with who is very conservative. And sometimes, and I'm not friends with them on Facebook or Instagram or anything. And I sometimes go just to see what the other side is really thinking, Okay. I'm like, what is happening? Because in my life, I'm like, well, of course.
Right.
Of course, everybody hates Trump, right? But that's a small sample size.
Right.
Hence, sample size.
So you do not disprove Neil's argument that we have stereotypes of the other side. I like it.
I'm sorry. Even being from Ohio,
Yes. Okay. Time for just a couple more questions. So a question from Nick. Thank you, Nick. So why should we care so much about the election results? So why should we care so much about the election results in the larger scale of the country when the political pendulum consistently swings back and forth? So I guess, so why is it so high stakes, given that, Nick, correct me if I'm overstating your question. Why is it so high stakes if just wait a few years and you'll be back, right?
That's a really good question. And I always used to ask maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, all these political scientists are studying polarization, yet the stock market keeps going up and up. And it's almost as though the market doesn't pay attention to political science research, but that's a conversation for another time. Nor risk in the tails, which is also another conversation.
Sure.
I think the thing I worry about that question is that yes, the question is you have to survive all of these inflection points. And democracy is not just a thing that exists as a scientific fact. It's a set of norms that are actually more fragile than you think. And so I just worry that just like trusting that everything will go back to normal is a little bit lackadaisical, because it kind of is thinking like, oh, democracy is like gravity. And it's like the end of history. Everyone will just agree with democracy. Yet, just like science, it's not like people like inherently love it. There actually is a human tendency to like strong leaders in authoritarianism. And fundamentally, democracy has value if it improves people's lives. Science has value if it improves people's lives. And if people perceive that it doesn't, they can turn to other systems and other values.
So we're nearing the point where I'm going to ask you about sort of what your thoughts are going forward. But I just want to, on this depressing note, I want to ask, so in your mind, is affective polarization really dangerous and we should be really worried about it? And it could really get in the way of, say, healthy democratic norms and things like that if we're fighting over elections as much as we are? Or is it something that's tense and unpleasant, but not necessarily a threat to democracy in this way?
I think we don't know. And I think the next research agenda in WAVE has to address this question. A lot of the existing research is more descriptive, like it's trying to document this is what's going on. But just like a question I just have, which I think research should do, is you go to like a congressperson's Facebook post or whatever. You could even go to a company's, and the comments they get are like super extreme. And this is what these people are being exposed to. And that's the affective polarization. So do they read this and they say, oh, like I got to respond to this affective polarization? And that's, I think, the open question. Like, is this somehow causally related to the Congress people becoming more extreme and both selecting into Congress and becoming more extreme?
Right. So we could, because we think we are so different and because we have such disdain for the other side, we might kind of make ourselves more extreme in terms of who we're voting for because the other side seems so unpalatable.
Exactly. And that's what negative partisanship's about, and pushing our elected leaders to like respond to this.
Right.
They think like, oh, this is what the people want.
Yeah. That's what I was wondering about. Sorry, I'm taking.
No, do it. Yes.
But that's what I was wondering about, is because it does feel like there is such a huge disconnect from how people actually feel and what politicians are talking about, like the conversation and what they represent, right? And I do, if I talk to family members that are Republican, if I talk to people on the other side, they're never like spilling vitriol. You know what I mean? Like they're never like outright mean. They're never like, I want to take away your rights. Like it's a very different conversation. And so I'm wondering to what extent like this is a machine that continues to run based on like politicians somehow assuming this is what we want, or just not really caring what we want anyway.
Yeah, where is this extreme legislator?
Yeah, where is it coming from?
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of hypotheses, but I think one of the more interesting ones is they've done surveys of legislators, including Republican legislators, and the legislators themselves misperceive the constituents as being, like, for example, more conservative than they actually are. And there's many questions like, why do they get this misperception? And part of it could be like availability heuristic, like who are they interacting, who's calling their offices, who are they interacting with on a daily basis? And does that distort their judgment? Because it's not like they're like polling their own constituents constantly. Those are expensive. They do them during elections. Tends to be about the vote, the horse race.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not actually finding out. So final piece here. So to give us some hope. So we have a final question. Is there an argument to be made that there's a causal relationship between polarization polarization and an inability to think critically? So is one step forward? I'm going to add on to this question. So critical thinking, thoughtfulness about the other side, recognition of nuance, descriptions of like what Sarah is saying about when she talks to her family and we're not actually spitting vitriol. Like, do we all just need to be a lot more thoughtful and be aware of what's going on to keep this from getting worse? Or is that, again, if you knew the answer, we wouldn't need to have this conversation? But
that's an argument people will give. And maybe we should be testing that out more. So doing more like randomized controlled trials of like critical thinking classes in grade school and looking at cohorts. Maybe that's what we should be investing in.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I would say that like, if you look at curricula, critical thinking, like that as a topic in and of itself is not really part of the many curricula.
So Sarah, pre-K grade school instructor. We are all depending on you.
And I think, on the education piece, like there actually is there are some national standards for curricula, but states can opt into those, right? Like there's no actual standard for what we actually require of kids to learn for critical thinking. And so, there actually is a ton of research about what works in education and what helps kids think critically, what helps kids solve problems. Schools are not implementing them for many reasons. One, they don't have to, but they're also really expensive. A lot of these things, they require more staff, they require more individualized attention, they require more small group instruction. And so schools are strapped for cash and strapped for teachers. There's a national teacher shortage. So they actually have no ability to implement some of these things that like piles of research say we actually know is effective.
Okay. So more critical thinking in schools. I did not expect this conversation to end there, but that is where we've landed. More of that for sure. Final two questions for each of you. One, who do you think's winning and when do you think the election will end? And two, where can people find you online and find more? Neil, let's go to you first.
I would say, I'll give Biden 80%. And I think we'll know in 2 days.
2 days.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter.
Cool. Twitter, what's your Twitter handle?
At N.A. Malhotra.
At N.A. Malhotra. Fantastic. And Sarah, what do you think is going to happen and where can people find you?
I think I'm going to go to Canada once they open the border. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to stay here. I'm in it for the long haul, baby. I think...
I'll have you back on after the election and we'll talk again about that. But I'll believe you till then. Yes.
Yeah, I do think it will be Biden. I don't know by what percentage, but you can find me on Instagram at Sarah Garner Meow.
Meow like the cat?
Like the cat, meow. And Twitter, Sarah Garner, or Sarah Meow Bliss.
That's an amazing Twitter handle. Sorry, Neil. Sarah wins the Twitter handle award.
Neil, you win the smart research handle, and I have the performing drunk on stages someday again in my life. You know what I mean?
Perfect. See, we're bringing the world together. All right. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your time and your thoughts with us. Thank you to everyone who watched on the live stream, everyone who donated. We are here next week to talk about the role of the media. We hinted at it. We'll be getting more into it and the history of how we thought about the media with Neil's colleague and many-time co-author, Shanto Iyengar, and that will be a great conversation. So see you next week, 7 p.m. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea.
Bye. Thanks.